Your career, in some ways, has its foundation in history in that you were elected in a district where you apparently were the first Democrat since the Grover Cleveland era. So I'm curious as to how your interest in history, given that starting point, has affected your career in public life and your perspective on public life.
Well, I actually developed an interest in history in college. I majored in history as a student, thought seriously of becoming a historian, but I've always had that perspective in mind, and it's had, I think, quite a profound impact on my career. I very quickly learned in the Congress that the beginning point, as you looked at an issue, was to understand the background, to understand the history. Whether you're talking about financial deregulation or Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, it's very important for people in public policy to have the advantage that history brings through its perspective on the issue. And I think we would be better able to reach consensus on many issues in this country if we had an appreciation of the common history that is involved in so many public issues.
Given that, and I've also heard you say that you would like to see all citizens, in essence, play a larger role in public culture, and in a sense, the obligation of every citizen to figure out what it is that they can do. You've just argued that historians can bring something particular to the table in our participation in public life. And so I'm curious, given your assumption that it would be useful for people in public life to understand what we do, how can we do it better? What can historians do to have that kind of impact on public life that you've just described?
I think the historian brings a lot to the table in this sense. Certainly they bring a sense of context, of perspective. I think the historian brings to the American public policy official a sense of pride. If you know about our founding fathers and what they accomplished and how they accomplished it, and the marvelous history of our country, the successes and the failures, then I think you're motivated to do more. So I would like to see the historians much more involved in the public policy process. Let me give you a quick example. I read a statement the other day from one of our generals in Iraq, and he said, the statement really caught my eye. He said, "We've never understood this place." And I said to myself, my goodness, that's exactly on the mark. Just think what a historian of Iraq could have brought to American public policy if they had been able to get across the complexity and the difficulties of dealing with that country before we went in. I can give 100 examples of that.
Well, there's the obvious, the Vietnam era, the war beginning after we had already thrown the scholars out of the State Department. My colleagues would probably respond to that by saying, well, if he had read my work, he wouldn't have had that problem. So what can we do rather than lament that your general hasn't read our work? What is it that we can do to make ourselves more useful?
Well, I think you have to convey to the public policy people that you're prepared to be helpful. And I'm not sure you've always done that. In other words, I think oftentimes the historian has focused on his history and not tried to apply his knowledge of, or her knowledge of history to a given issue. You've got to make yourself available. And because members of Congress and people working in the executive branch are hard to reach, you've got to be very persistent and saying that you really do have information that can help them in their jobs. The one thing a politician appreciates is somebody coming into his office and saying, I want to help you. And so on a very simple level, the historian can go to their local senator, their local congressman, or maybe someone they know in the executive branch, and say to them, look, I know you've got a tough problem here in Afghanistan, or I know you've got a tough problem in dealing with the regulation of American financial institutions. Here's what I know that can be helpful to you. And I think you have to take that initiative.
Is this something that you have felt was a priority for you at the Wilson Center in terms of this kind of conversation?
Oh, very much so. I think I'm proud of the Wilson Center for a lot of reasons. I think we've created here over the past decades a community of scholars. We've created an environment which people can come here and apply their talents for a period of time without interruption. And I think that I'm proud of the fact that during my tenure we have focused more and more the historian, the political scientist, the anthropologist, and all the others on public policy issues. Wilson always believed that the scholar could learn from the politician and the politician could learn from the scholar. He was both, of course.
Right.
And that's a tremendously important insight. That's what the Wilson Center is all about, trying to get this mix of the academician and the politician.
Well, what makes your career unusual in that regard is that for historians, there's a third leg, which are the documents. And I'm curious as to, and you're unusual, I think, in the extent to which you've combined that conversation with being enmeshed in the documents. So I'm curious as to whether your experience with the 9/11 Commission pushed you, stimulated you to think differently about the relationship between history and memory, history and documentation.
Well, I have a real bias here, and the bias is towards openness and transparency. I've fought many, many battles in the Congress and since to open up the process more. Historians have been very good at that, in insisting. There's so many forces in government that push you towards secrecy. Don't let me handle it kind of an approach, particularly in the national security area. And I think we need to create much more pressure than we do for openness and transparency. Now there are, of course, instances when you've got real national security problems and you don't want that. But in the overwhelming number of cases, more openness, more transparency is going to benefit the American people and I think benefit the American government. Historians and others, myself included, I hope, have to keep making that case over and over. These documents must be declassified as quickly as possible. National security, genuine national security considerations, of course, being taken into consideration and made open to the public.
Well, and as you mentioned, this has been a high priority of the
Yes.
American Historical Association and the historical profession
They've been an
in general.
effective advocate for transparency.
What do you think has made us an effective advocate in that regard? Because
you folks deal with the documents. And
Right.
if you don't have the documents and if you don't have access to the papers, you can't do your job as well as if you did have them. And so I think you have a perspective here that is important. But it's not the only perspective with regard to transparency and openness. Many, many other people benefit from it other than historians. So I think it's a tendency in government to keep it secret, to keep it within your own domain. And there has to be constant pressure to break that down.
do you think there's any area in which this problem exists to such a large extent that we ought to be concentrating our efforts as far as documents that really need to be public that are not, whether it's 9/11 or any of the other commissions? I mean, your career is striking for the number of commissions that you have co-chaired.
Yeah.
What do we need access to?
Look, my position on my own papers in the Congress, my position on the 9/11 Commission, the Iraq Study Group and others, is to make those papers available, all of them. The national security experts can review them and they can indicate if there are genuine sources and methods that need to be protected. But overwhelmingly, public officials must take the position that papers, documents should be in the public domain. And that's, I've tried to do that throughout my career.
I'm curious, something you said earlier about how a historical perspective might help us more effectively talk to each other in the policy arena. And I know this has been one of your concerns for a long time, is the level of civility in the policy arena. And I'm struck purely impressionistically. I look in the Senate where you've had people like Alexander, Kennedy, Byrd, all of whom had an interest in history, and all of whom were especially effective at speaking across the aisle. Mm-hmm. Is there anything to this guess that I have that I'm building on what you said earlier? Do you think a historical perspective, you said you were a history major, that a historical perspective helps a legislator think more broadly, speak across the aisle more effectively, or did I just pull examples out?
No, I don't think there's any doubt about it. I'm not sure I can document that with the metrics, but I certainly have an instinctive feeling that a person that has a sense of the Congress, the issues it has dealt with over a period of time, the importance of the historical aspect of any issue, I think these people tend to be institutionalists. That is, people who want to make the Congress succeed. Whether you're in the majority or the minority, their interest is in making the country work. And in order for the country to work, the institutions of that country have to perform well. So what happens, I believe, in the Congress is that people that have a historical bent and seniority tend, I think, to become institutionalists. Members of Congress today get elected to Congress usually by running against the Congress.
Right.
I used to do it myself. And then I came to the awareness that I had a responsibility as a member of Congress, whether in the majority or the minority, to make it work. And I became then, as many others have, fortunately, a person who supported the institution. I used to ask myself the question, who speaks up and defends the Congress? Well, the fact of the matter is very few people do, even members of Congress. But we have to have more people doing that.
And it's the sense of history that helps people.
If you don't have a robust Congress, you do not have representative government.
And it's the respect for the past, one might argue, or respect for what people have accomplished in the past that helps you.
Absolutely. It gives you a pride. It gives you a sense of self-correction. You understand the country's successes, its failures, and how to correct those failures better. And I think a sense of history can just be invaluable to the public policy person.
Thank you.